Hi, this is Dr. Adam Weiss, and today we're going to talk about the organization of an academic research paper. So this is how academic journal articles are often organized, and this will be, if you're taking my research methods class or my educational research class, this will be how you structure your research reports for our class. Okay, here's an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go into each of these parts in specific detail. So I'm not going to actually go over them right in this slide, but we will discuss them in a few minutes. And there is one thing to note is that sometimes, depending on the academic journal, some of these elements might be either consolidated into one section, or sometimes these elements might be omitted. It really depends on the journal that you're trying to publish in, but for the most part, in general, a good research academic journal article would have these elements. So first of all, your research report or your academic article will begin with an abstract. Depending on the journal, it might tell you how long your abstract should be, but for our class, it will be brief. It will be about 75 to 150 words. And a good abstract provides a summary of what the paper is going to discuss. I would like to liken it to almost like the back of the book cover, where it tells you whether you can read it, and it gives you a hint if you want to read the entire book. The same thing is with the abstract. The academic researchers, when they're doing their literature review, when they're reading articles on the topic, they want to quickly see and scan to see if this journal article will be relevant to their research. And so that's why the abstract is important. So it summarizes not only the research topic, it offers a discussion of the research question and how the study is designed, the methodology, any kind of data analysis methods, and then the most important part probably for an abstract is the findings. So based off the findings and also the structure of the study, that can tell researchers whether or not they want to read the entire article. So next, a good academic research paper will have a strong introduction. An introduction will provide a general overview of the topic. So it might have some similar elements to your abstract, but it's going to be much more expansive in its discussion. It's going to discuss the importance or the relevance of the topic to practitioners, so why this topic is worthy of study. It will also include a purpose statement. What is the particular goal of the researcher in examining this or performing this study? Another thing that's really important is the introduction will explain how the current study will add to the existing literature. In general, you do not want to duplicate studies or repeat things that have already been thoroughly researched over time. And so the best academic research, for the most part, provides new insights that can help practitioners and researchers implement the researcher's findings. So it's important that whatever you're studying is you're taking a new take on the topic. You're adding something interesting to the current discussion. So maybe you are examining a different population than what other researchers have examined. You're either interviewing or surveying people that haven't been had their perspectives expressed before or published before. Perhaps you are examining a certain aspect of the topic that other researchers have not, or maybe you even, in terms of if you're doing quantitative research, maybe you have a hypothesis that has not been hypothesized before and you want to test your hypothesis. But either way, you do want to show the novelty and the importance of your study, and that's when you can write that in the introduction. Oops. The next section is what I like to call the research question section. Some research journals might actually put this as part of the introduction, but for our purposes, since I'm trying to teach new researchers how to write a research paper, I made it its own element of the paper. So in your research questions section, it's important that you realize that the research question is your general topic, but stated as a question. It's not the specific questions you're going to ask in your qualitative interviews or on your quantitative survey, depending on what kind of research you perform. So that's really important. So one way to think about your research question is to come up with a topic and then phrase it in the form of a question, and your research question is what you're trying to answer as a whole for the entire study. Another thing to think about in this section of your paper is not only to pose your research question, but also to explain why you chose this research question. So why was this meaningful to you as a researcher or practitioner, or why would this research question be relevant to the field that you are studying? So if you're working in education, or if you're doing research for sociology or counseling, why would your research question be important to people who are either studying that in that field, they're academics, or they're working in that field, they're practitioners? The fourth section, and once again, depending on the journal, this might not have its own section, it might be part of the introduction. But the fourth section, according to my structure, is the theoretical framework. So the theoretical framework is where the researcher discusses how they have examined different theories in the field related to the topic, and then chosen one theory to help them shape their study. So when they pick a theory from the academic research, it's going to shape and design how their methodology, how they pursue data collection and conduct the research. And it'll also affect the data analysis, how the researcher interprets the findings. And part of this, in your theoretical framework, it's important that you provide evidence for where this theory comes from. So the theory should come from academic research, it should come from other journal articles, or perhaps an academic textbook. And then you should cite or provide a general description of the theory, citing where you got that information. And then also it's sometimes relevant to provide a little bit of an introduction to that theory. So perhaps who was the pioneer who came up with that theory, or how has this theory been applied in the field so far. And then, of course, then after that, after you've introduced the theory and discussed the history behind the theory and why it's relevant to the study, then you will, of course, explain how you particularly employed that theoretical framework in your research design and in your interpretation of the findings. The next part is the literature review. And the literature review is a very important part of your research paper. The literature review provides the reader and also the researcher with background information on the topic. And so the literature review will be where you, the researcher, explore different academic articles or different academic texts that have discussed and published on this topic, and provide a synthesis of these different findings. And so actually when you organize your literature review, you are organizing it after you've read several articles or texts related to the subject written by other researchers, you're going to organize your literature review based off of themes. So you're not going to organize it based off individual summaries of articles. Like you wouldn't organize it with Article 1 summary, Article 2 summary, Article 3 summary. No, you wouldn't organize it like that. You would organize it based off of what you saw across the literature were common themes. So let's say you were doing a literature review on technology use in the classroom during the COVID-19 pandemic. Perhaps you might find the theme of lack of student engagement across several different research articles. If you find that, that can be your general theme, and then once you discuss that theme, you cite the specific articles that discuss that and what their findings were relevant to that theme. And then you might find another theme, like perhaps teachers felt unprepared in terms of training. Well, if that's the case, if that's one of your themes is the lack of preparation and training for teachers, then you would put that as a second theme. And then once again, you would find articles, and you could use some of the same articles you started with you would synthesize those articles' findings and, of course, cite them using, for example, APA in-text citation or whatever citation format you're using. For my class, we use APA. So when you would mention the author's name according to APA citation, you would discuss the factual information you got from an outside source, and then you put parentheses, the author's last name, and then the comma, and then the year of publication, and then close parentheses, and then a period at the end, or whatever punctuation mark goes at the end. So part of the literature review is to give you and to explain and provide a baseline of what has already been researched on the topic. And it also, because you explore what other people have written about, the fact that this has been a research topic illustrates and supports your justification for your study. If other people are researching the topic and finding it meaningful, then that means that the topic is something that's important. And so it justifies why you are pursuing your study. Another thing to note, though, is that at the end or at some part of the literature review, it would be beneficial to discuss how the current research is somewhat limited in terms of your aspect of the study, and to discuss how your study will either expand on the current literature, either extend it, so take what other people have found and apply it in a new situation, or provide a whole new discussion of the topic that has not yet been addressed in the literature. So at the end of your literature review, it's nice to justify, once again, why your study is relevant to the field. Why is it worth the academic's time to read your study compared to reading other studies or to just skip over the study? So obviously, if your study is adding something new, extending something that has previously been found and then applying it in a new situation, or just expanding on the topic as a whole, then obviously your research study is relevant. So the next section is your methodology section. And so the methodology section, another way to describe it could be the data collection section. And so your methodology discusses how you designed your study. For example, did you choose qualitative research? And please see my previous videos on the different types of research. But did you choose qualitative research, which often features small group interviews? Did you choose quantitative research, which often features either survey research or, if it's in the sciences, experimental research? Or did you conduct a mixed method study that has a combination of both qualitative and quantitative? Next, you'll discuss the specific instrument that you use to collect data. So if you were doing qualitative research and conducting small group interviews, then you would discuss some of the questions or the central topics on your interview protocol, the questions you're going to ask during your interviews. You would also, if you were doing quantitative research and you're discussing how you composed your survey, it would be the same thing. You would discuss maybe your sections of the survey, some of the general topics discussed, and perhaps how you structured your survey. Next, you'll discuss your sampling procedure. So how did you recruit participants for the study? So not only are you going to explain what kind of sampling procedure you use, for example, did you use probability sampling, which would be randomized sampling, or did you use non-probability sampling, which was not random? And one kind of common non-probability sampling or non-randomized sampling is convenience sampling, where you're sampling people that are either easily available to ask questions to, or people you know. So either way, you're going to describe your sampling procedure and why you chose this procedure, and why you would define this as this kind of procedure. So you recruited participants in this way, and so this justifies that, or this means that you used this kind of sampling procedure, and then you want to explain why you chose that sampling procedure. Next, you're going to also discuss when you created your data collection methods, either your qualitative interview protocol or your quantitative survey instrument. How did you maximize reliability in terms of ensuring that your results would be consistent no matter who gave the interview or administered the survey, or what time of day, or what location or environment the interview or the survey was administered? You would get consistent results. The next thing you want to discuss is how did you work to maximize validity in your research methods. And so validity, just to summarize, is how you made sure that your research method is as accurate and as precise a measurement of the phenomenon as possible. And so please see some of my other either videos or PowerPoints on reliability and validity for more details. But that is something you want to discuss in your methodology section. You want to discuss how you tried the best you could to make both a reliable and a valid data collection measurement. The next section will be your data analysis section. Sometimes research journals put this, depending on the journal, they might include this under methodology. I made it its own section, but like I said, it could have been consolidated depending on the format chosen by the research journal or the professor. The data analysis section of your paper is where you explain how you interpreted the results that you found. So if you're doing qualitative research, you would discuss how did you code for data using common themes and focused terms. And then also how did you, for quantitative data, you would discuss what kind of statistical analysis you used. Or if you just did descriptive analysis, how did you collect that descriptive data? Did you take the mean? Did you take the mode? What were you looking for in your descriptive data? But most of the time with quantitative research, especially when the part that actually gets published in academic journals, most of that research will have some form of statistical analysis. So it might be like a linear regression, or it might be the difference between means. But so the quantitative data analysis section is how you interpreted your data using statistics. For our introductory research class that I teach at the master's level, you do not need to understand statistics in order to be successful in that course. However, it is important to know that probably if you do pursue a doctorate degree, a doctoral degree, you will likely take some statistics courses. And if you choose to do quantitative research, there will be an expectation that you have some statistical analysis involved with your study. So in your data analysis section, you're also going to explain how you analyzed your data, and you should have support for your data analysis, whatever coding scheme you used or whatever statistical analysis method you chose, the statistical test. You should cite academic sources. And so you could cite things like textbooks or other journal articles, but you should have some kind of evidence for why you chose this way to analyze your data. Next will be your findings section of your paper. And so the findings is where you really get to the kind of the key element of your study and what new things you discovered from your research. And so in your findings section, you'll also provide evidence for why those were your findings for your research. And so it will look different for each type of research. So if you're doing a qualitative research paper, your findings, your evidence for your findings will often be, there'll be central themes that you found through your coding, and then you will support why those were central themes in the interviews with some kind of either some salient quotes that illustrate this finding. And then, of course, when you're quoting participants, it's good to make it anonymous. So you would say participant 1 or participant 2 or whoever, but you wouldn't say their actual name. And another way you can also justify, and I would actually recommend to do both in qualitative research, would be to count. It's pseudo-quantitative in some ways in that you're going to count the number of people that said something similar out of your total. So if you were interviewing new counselors to the profession, and you interviewed 20 new counselors, and 15 out of 20 mentioned they are struggling with a work-life balance and balancing their notes and the caseloads they have, then that would be relevant to mention. That's nearly that is 75% of the people that you interviewed said something similar, that they're struggling with the work-life balance. And then after you explain that, then I would offer one or two quotes to illustrate this. It would be it's good to introduce the quote instead of just going straight to what participant 1 said. It might be good to introduce the quote by saying, who is participant 1 in terms of, obviously you don't want to give their identity, but you might say some general things like where they work, or not where, but like what kind of field they work, not the location, but what field they work, or what kind of situation they were in, not the specific situation, no details that could be used to link to the identity of that person, but just to give background information of that participant, and then say their quote. And then you could once you do that a couple times, you can connect the quotes together and explain how it illustrates the theme you discussed. So that's what a qualitative findings section will look like. You'll often start with a theme, then you'll discuss the occurrence, the frequency. So how often out of the total number of was this theme addressed by participants? So how many out of the total said something similar to this theme? And then you'll have some salient quotes to illustrate that theme. And then you'll go on to the next theme, and then another theme. And so a good research article should have 3 to 5 themes, maybe 3 to 5 findings. So in the qualitative research should be themes, but 3 to 5 findings or more. At least 3 though would be good. And then for quantitative papers, your evidence will come primarily from the results of your descriptive analysis, your descriptive data. So descriptive data is like, the mean or the average or the mode, which is the most common most common data point that was observed. So you'll use your descriptive data, that could be some of your findings, but then also in most published quantitative articles, the main impetus or the main element of the quantitative findings section will be what were your findings from your statistical analysis. And so often this will look like what was the relationship between the two variables, how strong was that relationship, and how much of a predictor value does this relationship tell us. And so we'll get into that a little later in the course, but I did want to discuss that in this section. Then your third to last section is your discussion section. Your discussion section is where you provide your own commentary on your findings. So some of the things that you'll discuss are, did you answer your research question? Why or why not? And then another key part of your discussion is connecting what you found in your research to what other researchers have found in their research. So what you'll do is you'll connect your specific findings to findings from other researchers, and you'll name those researchers and their findings. You'll discuss, for example, how does your research support what other people have found? How does your research maybe contrast or contradict what other people have found? And perhaps maybe how does your research add on or expand or add something new to what other people have found? And so it's really important that you have a thorough discussion between how your findings relate to other people's findings, other researchers' findings. And so you'll have to probably go back to some of the findings in the literature review that you discussed and compare and contrast your findings to what was found in the literature review in the earlier part of your paper. And then you'll emphasize some of the new things that you discovered, or how your study proved unique, and how you gained added information on the topic. And how that topic, another thing to think about in the discussion section is, how does your findings support future research and future work by practitioners? So because of your study, what new research can be explored? Or because of your study, how could practitioners apply your findings into their work, into their practice? And in my class, since it's a little bit more of a personal research project, I want you all to discuss a little bit of how your findings might relate to your own work in your career. So your future work as either an educator or a counselor. Okay, so that's the discussion section. The second to last section is your limitations section. And so your limitations section is basically your honest admission that perhaps your study wasn't perfect. And every research paper has a limitation section, and it's accepted in the field that we as humans and researchers aren't perfect. So it's okay to be honest in your limitation section. In fact, researchers who don't have a limitation section or choose to ignore their limitations of their research are much more likely to be criticized. If you are open about your limitations of your research, you're much more likely to be appreciated by academic researchers. It's the people that choose to ignore their limitations and kind of try to skirt them under the rug that get into trouble. So what happens in your limitation section? So in your limitation section, you'll talk about first maybe some limitations of your sampling procedure, and how you might not have recruited a population that is of your study that was representative of the profession as a whole, or even the U.S. population as a whole. And so when we talk about that, when you don't have a representative population, then your study lacks generalizability. So generalizability is basically saying that your research could be applied. So even though you polled or you interviewed or surveyed only 100 people, or whatever number was your sample size of the number of people that you asked to participate in your study and did participate, even though you had a small number compared to the millions of people in the world, millions of people in the U.S. and billions of people in the world, your findings, if you do the sampling correctly, should be relatively generalizable. So you could expand what you found to say this is a general rule, or this could be a general trend across the United States or across this group of people in the United States. And that's the way you can state that is if your study is representative of the population as a whole. And the only way to truly have a representative study is to have randomized probability sampling that follows strict sampling procedures. And so many of you might not be able to do that. Many of you will be using convenience sampling because that's the fastest, easiest, and cheapest way to collect data. And so in that case, if you're using convenience sampling, and that could be also include like snowball sampling, where you ask one of your participants to give you, tell you some other people that you might want to interview. If you are doing either of those kinds of non-probability sampling, your generalizability of your study might be limited. Yes, it might tell you something important about that group of people that you studied, that region or that school or that community, but it might not tell you about teachers as a whole or counselors as a whole or the U.S. population as a whole. And so that's okay. You just have to admit that that's one of your limitations. That your research is meaningful. It's told you some important information about that group of people, but there's limitations to how far that could expand or be applied to the country as a whole. Another thing you'll mention in your limitations section are what were some threats to reliability in your study. So what were some issues that might have made your data collection methods not always consistent? Maybe there was some data collection errors. Maybe there was kind of a different researchers that were participating in the project collected data in a slightly different ways. There could be maturation of subjects where maybe some people just naturally change their point of view, or maybe even some people, there could be even subject mortality where people dropped out of the study for some reason. Another thing to think about is what were your limitations in terms of validity? What were your threats to validity? So in what way was your data collection method not ideal for providing the most accurate and precise data? So perhaps you may not have used maybe you used one test and there could have been other tests you could have used. Or you used one theory or one concept, and that was perhaps just one of the theories out there, and other theories could have been explored. Or maybe you had interaction of participants, and so participants might have discussed with each other the questions on the interviews or the survey, and that could have affected participants' answers. Or maybe there could have been an environmental situation where maybe some kind of sudden change in the community occurred, and that altered the way people answered answered the questions. So in your limitations section, you're going to talk about those three things. You're going to talk about reliability, threats to reliability, threats to validity, and threats to the generalizability of your study. And whenever you discuss each of those elements, you need to cite academic sources to explain why that would be a limitation. So why would academic researchers say, maybe we could have improved our study in this way? How would academic researchers say that this could interfere with reliability? What would academic researchers say could this element threaten validity? What would academic researchers say that your generalizability might be somewhat limited? So you have to have, I know it seems kind of ironic, but you need to have support for how your study might not have been perfect. So for each of your limitations, you should connect it back to some kind of academic source to explain, yes, this was not ideal. Also, in your limitations, it's nice to include what you would have done differently if you had unlimited resources or unlimited time. So stating to the reader, to the academic researcher, the practitioner, that you know what are best practices in research and that you would have applied those best practices if you had the time or the money or the ability to do it, at least that researcher sees, okay, this person knows best practices, they're being honest about some of their limitations that they had, but they know that in future research, and if they have additional resources, they'll try to adhere to make their study even more persuasive in terms of its findings, even more reliable and valid and generalizable. The last part of your paper will be your conclusion section. In your conclusion section, just like a conclusion for a general essay, you want to summarize your study and your results. You want to summarize it in a way that's a little bit slightly new. You don't want to have you don't want your conclusion to match your introduction or your abstract. You do also want to explain in new words why this study was important, how your findings and your study contributed to the existing literature, and how this study could be beneficial for practitioners in the field. You don't have to go into too much detail like you would have done with your discussion section, but you do want to reiterate how your study added to the existing research and how it's beneficial to people in the field. And then, this is very important, at the end of your conclusion, you should suggest ways that your study can be expanded upon or can be extended in the future. There's a couple reasons you do this. First of all, it's showing that you're thinking ahead and you're realizing that it's almost like in your limitations section, you're realizing that your study didn't examine every possible element of this topic and that more topics should be explored, but also it's giving you a justification and support for your future research. So if you see that, if you explain this in your conclusion section that, hey, in the future we should explore this element of the topic, or we should connect this topic to this new area or this new concept or this new context, then that gives you not only the idea of how you can expand on your research, but it also kind of gives legitimacy to perhaps your future research plans. All right, so, and then finally, I didn't include this as its own, it is its own section, but I know I said technically the last section of your paper is the conclusion, but this is its own section. It's not a general, narrative section where you're writing complete sentences like the other sections. Instead, the references section, depending on what format you use, APA or MLA format, will, another term for this is the end references section, will include full citations of where you got your sources. So all of the in-text citations that you had within your paper, explaining which specific author said what, you are going to then provide the full reference of where you could get that resource. So your reference, whatever citation format you use, will use things such as author's last name, the title of the publication, the entity of the journal or the publisher who published the publication, and the year of publication. So all of those things, no matter what format you choose, APA, MLA, Chicago, they'll all have those elements. But for my class, we're using APA format, and I've given some videos on that. So please reference those when you're doing your references page. Sometimes there are some online reference generators or citation generators. You have to be careful with those and double check them, because many times they're inaccurate. They might give you a general idea of how to cite this reference, but it's important that you double check them and you always refer back to the official agency's citation format. So APA is the American Psychological Association. So referring back to their actual publication on what is their format. And a good resource for this is Purdue University. It's an unusual name, but they call it AL, O-W-L. And they have a whole section of their writing center or their university that specializes on the different citation formats. And so you can always Google Purdue AL, O-W-L, and citation. And then that can help you find specific references on how to cite. All right, well, thank you all very much. I appreciate it. And please feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thank you.